How does a forgotten backwater grow into the most powerful empire of its time, only to collapse into myth and ruin? What's the real history behind the city that once inspired awe across the ancient world and terror in religious texts for centuries to come? This is the story of Babylon, its rise, its rule, its myths, and its ultimate fall. And yes, along the way, we'll uncover the real story behind the Tower of Babel. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want more journeys like this through ancient history. Before Babylon became the center of empires and the symbol of divine arrogance, it was a quiet settlement, almost invisible against the backdrop of southern Mesopotamia's great city-states. While cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur were shaping early civilization, Babylon was little more than a name in the margins, if that. Archaeological evidence suggests that people had been living on the site as early as the late 4th millennium BC. But for nearly 1,000 years, Babylon remained a modest town, overshadowed by the political powerhouses of Sumer and Akkad. It had no mighty ziggurat, no god of supreme authority, and no army worth fearing. If you were an ambitious merchant or a traveling scribe during this era, Babylon probably wasn't even on your list of stops. Yet its geography held promise that few recognized at the time. Positioned between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Babylon sat on the edge of two worlds, Sumer to the south and Akkad to the north. This intersection of cultures, languages, and trade routes would later become its greatest asset. Babylon was not just between rivers, it was between civilizations. The earliest written references to Babylon appeared during the decline of the Akkadian Empire, in the late 22nd century BC. At that time, the city was under the authority of the powerful kings of Akkad, including the legendary Sargon and his descendants. But even then, it held no real status. The city wasn't a capital, nor a religious hub. It was simply a strategic dot, a useful location in the administrative machinery of empires larger than itself. After the fall of Akkad, Babylon came under the control of the third dynasty of Ur. During this period, it was demoted to the role of a provincial outpost, run by officials sent from Ur. Its name may have meant Gate of the Gods, but in practice, Babylon was a gate few sought to pass through. It was still peripheral, provincial, and politically irrelevant, but what it lacked in prestige, it made up for in potential. Babylon's proximity to key irrigation systems and its position at a trade junction quietly laid the groundwork for its future. As the old order began to crack and the great southern cities weakened under external threats and internal divisions, Babylon, protected by its obscurity, survived. And survival in ancient Mesopotamia was the first step to greatness. Babylon wasn't born great, it became great because it endured long enough to seize opportunity when the time came. And that moment was just around the corner. By the dawn of the 2nd millennium BC, the old Mesopotamian order had fractured. The third dynasty of Ur collapsed under the pressure of internal unrest and repeated invasions. The great cities of Sumer were no longer united, and Mesopotamia descended into a fragmented landscape of rival states, competing for land, canals, and trade routes. Into this volatile vacuum stepped a new force, the Amorites. The Amorites were Semitic-speaking tribes from the western deserts, outsiders by Sumerian standards. Initially seen as disruptive nomads, they had long been infiltrating Mesopotamia's urban centers, settling in the outskirts, and gradually integrating into the region's complex social fabric. And when the old dynasties fell, they were among the first to capitalize on the chaos. In 1894 BC, an Amorite chieftain named Sumu-Abum seized control of Babylon. This marked a decisive turning point. For the first time in its history, Babylon became an independent political entity. Sumu-Abum did not claim ties to the old Sumerian kings, nor align himself with fading Akkadian legacies. He was a new kind of ruler, his power grounded not in ancient tradition, but in practical authority. Sumu-Abum's control over Babylon was modest at first. The city was still small, its influence local, and its army limited. Babylon could not yet rival major centers like Larsa, Isin, or Eshnunna, which were locked in constant struggle for supremacy. But what set Babylon apart was its newfound stability. While other city-states exhausted themselves in endless conflict, Babylon, under Amorite leadership, focused on consolidation. Over the next few generations, Sumu-Abum's successors, particularly Sumula-El, Sabium, and Apil-Sin, laid the administrative and economic groundwork for something greater. They expanded Babylon's territory northward, developed irrigation systems, and secured trade routes. In a world of turmoil, Babylon offered continuity. It is during this period that Babylon began to carve out its identity, not as a mere city among many, but as a contender for regional influence. Though it remained in the shadow of more dominant states, Babylon's independence under the Amorites gave it something invaluable: time. Time to grow, to plan, and to wait for the right leader, one who would transform it from a local power into an imperial capital. That leader was coming. His name was Hammurabi. When Hammurabi ascended to the throne of Babylon in 1792 BC, the city was still a regional player, respected, but far from dominant. It had expanded modestly under his Amorite predecessors, yet remained eclipsed by more powerful neighbors like Larsa, which controlled much of the agriculturally rich south, and Eshnunna and Mari to the northeast, both strategically situated along major trade arteries. Babylon's position was stable, but its potential remained unrealized. Hammurabi changed everything, not through brute force alone, but through patience, calculation, and a deep understanding of power. In the early years of his reign, he focused on domestic governance. He repaired canals, strengthened tax systems, restructured the legal bureaucracy, and reinforced Babylon's agricultural foundations. These weren't glamorous acts of conquest, but they laid the backbone of an economic engine that could support a military campaign when the time was right. That time came midway through his reign. In 1763 BC, Hammurabi launched a decisive strike against Larsa, Babylon's most formidable southern rival. The victory was monumental, not just in military terms, but symbolic ones. Larsa's defeat marked the moment Babylon stepped out of the shadows. From there, Hammurabi moved quickly, turning his attention to the north and northeast. In just a few years, he brought Eshnunna and Mari under Babylonian control, ending centuries of rivalry among the southern and central Mesopotamian city-states. What emerged was the Old Babylonian Empire, a realm stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Middle Euphrates Valley, uniting much of Mesopotamia under a single rule for the first time since the Akkadian Empire centuries earlier. But Hammurabi wasn't merely an empire builder. He was also a lawgiver. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed in stone and displayed in the heart of the city, proclaimed not only legal regulations, but a worldview. Its prologue asserted that the laws were given to Hammurabi by Marduk, Babylon's patron god, with the purpose of establishing justice on earth and protecting the weak from the strong. In a society deeply intertwined with the divine, this was a profound declaration. The king wasn't just a political ruler, he was an earthly executor of divine will. The code addressed nearly every facet of life: contracts, debts, trade, theft, marriage, inheritance, and criminal punishment. But it wasn't egalitarian. Punishments and protections depended heavily on social class. The elite Oilam, or free landowners, enjoyed legal privileges that Muskinim, commoners, and Wardam, slaves, did not. A crime against a noble could bring death. The same crime against a slave might result in a fine. Justice was not blind, it was stratified. Still, the code provided a rare form of predictability in a volatile world. In combining religion, law, and royal authority, Hammurabi created a state model that would influence rulers for centuries, both within and beyond Mesopotamia. Under his leadership, Babylon was not just the seat of political power, it became a spiritual capital. The god Marduk, once a relatively minor deity, was elevated to the highest status in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Temples were expanded, festivals reorganized, and rituals redesigned to reflect Babylon's new place at the center of the world. But Hammurabi's empire, like the ones before it, would prove fragile after his death. His vision was grand, his laws were enduring, but the unity he forged would not last beyond his son's reign. The fault lines beneath the empire were already beginning to show. And soon, Babylon would be tested once again, this time, not by city-state rivals, but by a wave of chaos, rebellion, and invasion. The brilliance of Hammurabi's empire didn't survive long beyond his death. His son, Samsu-Iluna, inherited not just the throne, but the burden of holding together a realm stitched from conquest. And very quickly, the seams began to unravel. The vast territory his father had built proved difficult to govern. Rebellions flared across the south, in cities like Uruk, Isin, and Larsa, all of which had long histories of independence and local pride. The former allies and vassals of Babylon turned restless and soon hostile. The southern regions broke away, weakening Babylon's economic base and agricultural control. At the same time, new forces emerged on the northern and eastern frontiers, challenging the authority of a capital struggling to maintain its grip. By the middle of the 17th century BC, Babylon's decline had accelerated. The centralized bureaucracy that Hammurabi had carefully shaped fell into disarray. The kingdom was shrinking. Royal records became sparse. Trade routes faltered. The old imperial order collapsed into fragmentation. And into this vacuum stepped an unlikely group, the Kassites. The Kassites were highland people from the Zagros Mountains to the northeast, little known and long underestimated by Mesopotamian elites. At first they appeared in Babylonian records as raiders and mercenaries. Intermittent, disruptive, but not existential threats. That changed around 1595 BC, when the Hittite king Mursili I launched a sudden strike on Babylon, looted the city, and withdrew almost immediately. The assault shattered the last remnants of the old Amorite dynasty. The Kassites didn't waste the opportunity. They moved in, not as invaders, but as heirs, absorbing what remained of Babylon's institutions and reshaping them from within. Unlike the Hittites, the Kassites chose not to destroy. Instead, they adopted the Babylonian language, honored the gods, and preserved the city's administrative and religious core. This approach allowed them to gain legitimacy and local support without the need for overwhelming force. The Kassite period marked one of the longest and most stable eras in Babylon's history. Their dynasty, lasting over 4 centuries, was defined not by military expansion, but by internal development and international diplomacy. Babylon became a respected member of the Bronze Age's elite club of powers, maintaining regular correspondence with the Egyptian pharaohs, the kings of the Hittites, and rulers of Elam and Assyria. Evidence of these relationships survives in clay tablet letters from Amarna, where Babylonian kings were treated as equals by the pharaohs. These exchanges included royal gifts, political marriages, and even joint appeals to deities for favorable weather or military victory. Babylon was no longer just a regional power. It had become part of a broader geopolitical network that stretched across the ancient Near East. And yet, the Kassite kings didn't rule by brute dominance. Their strength lay in balancing tradition with pragmatism. They restored temples, rebuilt infrastructure, and respected the religious hierarchy centered on the cult of Marduk. One particularly symbolic act was the return of Marduk's statue, stolen during the Hittite sack. Its reinstatement reaffirmed the divine connection between Babylon and its gods, signaling that, despite recent turmoil, the city's sacred order had been restored. But this revival, like all before it, would eventually face its limits. External pressures were building, and Babylon's place at the center of Mesopotamian power would soon be challenged once again. This time, by an empire rising with calculated ambition to the north, Assyria. By the late 2nd millennium BC, the Kassite dynasty, once a symbol of Babylonian revival, had grown increasingly stagnant. Their centuries-long rule had fostered stability, but over time, that stability calcified into inertia. Babylon's influence, once respected across the courts of Egypt and Anatolia, began to wane. And while Babylon drifted into cultural twilight, Assyria, to the north, was awakening with imperial ambition. The Assyrians had once lived under Babylon's shadow, but by the early 1st millennium BC, they had transformed into a military juggernaut. Under kings like Ashurubal I, Tiglath-Pileser I, and later Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria reshaped itself into a centralized, conquest-driven war machine. Babylon, weakened and politically fractured after the fall of the Kassites, stood directly in the path of this rising power. At first, Babylonian kings tried to maintain autonomy by negotiating and cooperating with Assyrian rulers. There were even moments of alignment between the two empires, but such arrangements were fragile. Babylon was still rich in prestige, sacred authority, and agricultural wealth. Assyria, driven by expansion, saw control over Babylon as both strategically necessary and symbolically irresistible. By the 8th century BC, Babylon had become a pawn in Assyria's imperial games. Kings were installed and removed at the whims of Assyrian emperors. Rebellions became frequent. Native Babylonian rulers, chafing under foreign control, attempted to break free, but the responses were swift and brutal. The most devastating blow came under Sennacherib, one of Assyria's most feared kings. In 689 BC, after yet another rebellion in Babylon, Sennacherib enacted a policy of total annihilation. His forces didn't just suppress the revolt, they erased the city. Temples were torn down, palaces burned, and sacred statues destroyed. The Euphrates itself was diverted to flood the ruins. Sennacherib's goal wasn't simply punishment, it was obliteration, a deliberate attempt to erase Babylon as a political and spiritual rival. This act shocked the ancient world. Babylon, for all its political turbulence, was still seen as a sacred city. Destroying it wasn't just a military decision, it was sacrilege. The backlash even rippled into Assyria itself. Sennacherib's brutal legacy would later haunt his own dynasty. His successor, Esarhaddon, recognized the spiritual and political cost of Babylon's destruction. He reversed course. In a dramatic gesture of reconciliation, Esarhaddon ordered the reconstruction of Babylon, restored the temples, and returned the cult statue of Marduk to its proper home. It was a calculated effort to restore balance between Assyria's secular power and Babylon's sacred identity. But the wounds ran deep. Babylon's autonomy was gone. From this point on, it lived under Assyrian domination, a sacred capital whose kings were chosen not by their people, but by foreign rulers in Nineveh. Even its religious traditions became tools in the hands of Assyrian propaganda. And yet Babylon endured, enduring not by strength, but by symbolism. The next attempt to restore its independence would come from within, led not by a Babylonian noble or priest, but by a new people rising from the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans. The Assyrian yoke had weighed heavily on Babylon for more than a century. Its kings reduced to vassals, its religious life manipulated, and its sovereignty crushed under the might of Nineveh. But even empires built on terror eventually crumble. By the late 7th century BC, Assyria was fracturing. Years of overextension, internal succession crises, and constant rebellion had drained its strength. Into this power vacuum stepped a new leader, Nabopolassar, a Chaldean from southern Mesopotamia. In 626 BC, he launched a rebellion against Assyrian rule and seized Babylon. His revolt was not an isolated uprising. It was a calculated, coordinated campaign to reclaim independence and restore Babylonian dignity. Over the next decade, Nabopolassar skillfully consolidated power across southern Mesopotamia. He forged a critical alliance with the Medes, a rising force in the Iranian highlands. Together, they unleashed a series of devastating assaults on the heart of Assyria. In 612 BC, they captured and utterly destroyed Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. The empire that had once raised Babylon was now reduced to ashes. From these ruins rose the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a new chapter, built on ancient foundations but infused with renewed ambition. And when Nabopolassar died in 605 BC, the throne passed to his son, a man whose name would echo through history, Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar was not only a formidable military commander, but a visionary builder and symbolic king. Early in his reign, he turned westward, campaigning across Syria and the Levant. He crushed rebellious vassals, including Judah, where in 586 BC he laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and deported the elite of Jewish society to Babylon, a moment etched into biblical memory as the Babylonian captivity. But Nebuchadnezzar's legacy was forged not just in war, but in stone. Under his direction, Babylon became the grandest city the world had ever seen. He rebuilt its defenses, wrapping the city in massive double walls and surrounding them with a deep moat. The legendary Ishtar Gate, faced with blue-glazed bricks and adorned with lions, bulls, and dragons, stood as a majestic entrance to the capital. From the gate stretched the processional way, a stone-paved road used during religious festivals, leading directly to the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, where kings would reaffirm their divine right to rule. Towering over it all stood the Etemenanki Ziggurat, a massive step temple rising nearly 90 meters high, believed by many scholars to be the real-world inspiration behind the Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar also commissioned what would later be called one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Ancient texts describe a lush, terraced paradise built to ease the homesickness of his Median wife, Amytis, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. While archaeological evidence remains elusive, the legend endured, a symbol of Babylon's grandeur, blending architecture with myth. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for over 4 decades, leaving behind a city that embodied imperial majesty, religious power, and unmatched cultural prestige. Under his reign, Babylon became more than a capital. It became the symbolic heart of the ancient Near East, a place where gods descended, kings rose, and civilizations collided. But like every golden age, this one was fleeting. The seeds of decline had already begun to take root. And Babylon's future, once again, would be shaped not glory but by crisis. As mighty as Nebuchadnezzar II's Babylon had become, the empire he left behind did not inherit his strength of vision, or his grip on power. Within just a few years of his death in 562 BC, the cracks began to show. Succession disputes, court conspiracies, and weak leadership unraveled the political stability that had held the Neo-Babylonian Empire together. Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by his son, Amel-Marduk, whose reign was short and unpopular. He was overthrown by his brother-in-law Neriglissar, a military commander with stronger support among the elite. But even this new regime failed to establish lasting authority. The throne passed rapidly between short-lived kings, each undermined by palace coups or public distrust. Within just 6 years, Babylon had cycled through 4 rulers. In 556 BC, a man named Nabonidus seized power. His reign was as controversial as it was unusual. Nabonidus wasn't of royal blood, and his policies, particularly his religious reforms, alienated the very priesthood that had long upheld Babylonian kingship. He attempted to shift royal devotion from Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, to the moon god Sin, and even relocated himself to Timah, an oasis in northern Arabia, for nearly a decade. In his absence, he left his son Belshazzar to govern Babylon, a name later immortalized in the Bible's tale of divine judgment. But Babylon's real threat wasn't religious division, it was external. To the east, a new power was rising, the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. In a matter of years, Cyrus had conquered Media, Lydia, and parts of Central Asia. Babylon was next. By 539 BC, the Persian army advanced westward, crossing the Tigris with minimal resistance. Babylon's defenders, already demoralized and divided, were no match for Cyrus's disciplined forces. At the Battle of Opis, the Babylonian army was crushed. But perhaps more stunning than the defeat was what followed. Babylon surrendered without a fight. According to both Babylonian chronicles and later Greek accounts, the gates of the city were opened, possibly by its own nobles, who had lost faith in Nabonidus. Cyrus entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. He spared the temples, reinstated Marduk's cult, and allowed deported peoples, like the Jews exiled from Jerusalem, to return to their homelands. In the eyes of many Babylonians, Cyrus offered a restoration of sacred order, not its violation. With that, the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to an end. It had lasted less than a century, yet in that brief span had produced one of the most enduring legacies of the ancient world, its art, architecture, religion, and legends echoing far beyond its political lifespan. Babylon became one of the Persian Empire's key provincial capitals, still wealthy, still grand, but no longer sovereign. Its name would live on, but the power it once wielded had passed into the hands of others. And as the centuries progressed, even that legacy would fade, brick by brick, stone by stone, until all that remained were ruins and stories. Yet Babylon's story was not over. Another conqueror was on the horizon, one who would dream of making the city the capital of the world. If you've made it this far, thank you. Seriously. Thank you. We put a lot into making videos like this, and it means the world to us that you stuck around through the fall of empires and the rise of myths. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell for more deep dives into ancient civilizations. Drop your thoughts, theories, or favorite Babylonian fact in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay curious.